Hi, my name is Doug Hecker. I was born in San Francisco. I moved to Petaluma in 1971. I went to Casa Grande High School in Petaluma. I then went to Santa Rosa Junior College, and then ultimately I got my degree in communications from Sonoma State University. And while I was at Sonoma State, I was the editor-in-chief of the student newspaper. I started out as a staff writer, worked my way up to sports editor, and then ultimately the editor-in-chief of the newspaper. I wrote editorials, news stories, sports stories, did some investigative pieces. I then I enrolled in the Project Censored course at Sonoma State University when Peter Phillips was formerly, he was actually the director of Project Censored when I was a student there and my professor. When I was a student at Sonoma State University, enrolled in the Project Censored course, I initially took the course because it fit into my schedule, to be honest with you. And it was actually recommended also by Jonah Raskin, my department chair and advisor. Once I got into the class, after the first class with Peter Phillips, I was actually initially hooked. I was finding out about stories that Project Censored had been uncovering for years that corporate media not inadvertently missed, but purposefully missed. Corporate media is basically there to sell advertising, and they're not going to step on the toes or bite the hand that feeds them. So I was really excited about the Project Censored course at Sonoma State University and to learn what they had been doing for years. Of course, Carl Jensen founded the program, which has been going on now for over 36 years. I worked on a story that was published in the 1997 edition of the annual Project Censored book. After graduation, I got a job in sales, did that for a few years and knew that my passion was writing and I wanted to be a writer in some form, so I got a job as a technical writer in the high-tech industry, did that for a number of years. And then once the high-tech industry sort of imploded in our area, I went into real estate, and that's what I've been doing for the past 11 years plus. So after Sonoma State University, I was very busy with my family, my wife, my kids. Well, at the time, 2 kids. I have 3 kids now, 6-year-old son, 12-year-old daughter, and a 17-year-old son. I sort of lost track of what Project Censored was doing. Not just Project Censored, the course or the book, but what they were doing for the greater good of humankind, exposing stories, factual stories, fact-based stories, to the world, not just the American public, but to the world. Because here in America, it's often said that we're the most entertained and least informed society in the world. In fact, I talk to people from other parts of the world who say they know more about what's going on in America than we do here. And I believe that to be true. There's probably about a 10-year stint from 1997 to 2007 where I was very busy with, my wife and I raising our children, all their sporting events, their extracurricular activities, their school, education. And you sort of get so busy in your daily life in America that you tend to overlook things that maybe you had a passion for in the past when you weren't busy raising a family. And that happened with me. I kind of lost track of the news, paid more attention to corporate news than alternative news, alternative media. And then in 2007, a chance encounter happened when I met my film partner, Christopher Oscar, through actually business that he and I were both doing, myself as a realtor and he as a advertising manager for a newspaper. Ironically enough, the newspaper that actually printed my college newspaper that I was the editor-in-chief of. Chris worked at the Sonoma Index-Tribune, and they have an in-house printing machine, and they printed our college newspaper for us. So anyhow, Chris and I met via this chance encounter through business, and Chris had mentioned that he had an insight he wanted to do a document. Chris had an insight that he wanted to make a documentary film about Project Censored. And he asked me if I knew about Project Censored after I had told him that I was a graduate from Sonoma State University. And I had mentioned to Chris that, yeah, not only do I know Project Censored, I was a former student and had my story published in 1997. And Chris's eyes lit up pretty big. He then informed me that he had this insight to make a documentary film about Project Censored. And his next step was to meet somebody tied to Project Censored in some form. And we met, that very day. And Chris kind of pitched his idea to me. And by that time, I had been out of the education facility or the education genre, whatever you want to call it, education system. I'd been out of the education system for about 10 years, and I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to get back to my writing roots as a journalism major, and I wanted to do something that would just kind of get my creative juices flowing again. So I told Chris, yeah, let's meet and talk about your insight, and we did. We met, I think, later that week, talked about the film, and I'd mentioned to him that I still had ties to Sonoma State University and Project Censored because Peter Phillips was still the director at the time of Project Censored. So I called Peter, refreshed him on who I was and what I'd been doing, and then our idea, and he said, sure, I'd like to meet with you guys. So a week or so later, we met with Peter Phillips, pitched our idea to him, and he really liked the fact that, yes, somebody was going to do a documentary film on Project Censored. He also mentioned that if he had a nickel for every time somebody told him that they were going to do a film on Project Censored, he'd be a rich man. So Chris and I, again, pitched our idea, and then Peter Phillips, after doing some administrative background stuff, because there was somebody who was thinking about doing a Project Censored film. They had the rights, but the rights expired. And then Chris and I picked up the rights, and we started working on the film in 2007. And here we are, fast forward to 2013, and we've completed our mission. We've completed the project. We've completed the film. So along my journey of making this film over the past 6 years with my film partner Christopher Oscar, I got back into sort of that activism role that I learned about when I was a student at Sonoma State University, writing for the student newspaper, working on important subject matter for Project Censored, which I lost for about 10 years, just being busy, being a husband and a father, everything that comes with that, coaching youth sports, baseball, soccer, mountain biking, just all of those things that we like to do here in America with those freedoms that we cherish and we don't take for granted. However, being an activist doesn't mean that you have to go to some rally or protest and hold up a picket sign. Being an activist means that you have to look out for your fellow brothers and sisters, for humanity itself. When you see injustices, when you read about injustices, when you know that corporate media is not giving fact-based news and information, which then is ultimately leading to kind of the demise of our country where we're at currently, economic crisis after economic crisis, humanitarian crisis after humanitarian crisis, people who can't afford health care, starving people not only here in the United States, but throughout the world. That's what led me to realize that, hey, through film, through this documentary film, Chris and I are making a difference. Whether 10 people watch this film or 100,000 people watch this film, we know that we're making a difference. Not everybody has the means to make a film or be published, but what people do have is time, and activism takes time. Time to realize that you can't sit back and be complacent and let what's happening to our country, our nation, and other countries and other nations just happen and think that your vote doesn't count, that what you may blog on the internet doesn't count. It all counts, because activism basically comes from the heart of humanity. When atrocities are happening in other countries or within our own country, those need to be pointed out. And those are the stories that corporate media deliberately keeps from not only the American public, but from the world.